Ethan Parker adjusted the strap of his helmet as he walked through the firehouse garage, his boots clunking against the concrete floor. For the past 12 years, Ethan had been the kind of firefighter people counted on not just for his skill in an emergency, but for his steady presence that reassured everyone around him. Pinewood Creek wasn't a large town, but it had its share of challenges, and Ethan always met them head-on. He had grown up in Pinewood Creek and knew every corner of it: the quiet residential streets, the little park by the river, and the diner where most of the town seemed to gather at least once a week. He felt a deep connection to the people and places here. To him, being a firefighter wasn't just a job, it was a way to give back to the community that had shaped him. That morning, the firehouse was unusually quiet. The rain had finally stopped after a week of relentless downpours, leaving the streets damp and the air cool with a hint of spring. Ethan was seated at the long wooden table in the kitchen, eating a sandwich while his colleagues bantered about the upcoming town festival. "Think they'll still do the fireworks if the ground's this muddy?" asked Mike, a wiry firefighter who always seemed to have an opinion about everything. "They'd better," said Jenna, their team medic, as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Half the town's already put up tents and decorations. A little mud won't stop Pinewood Creek." Ethan smiled but stayed quiet. He liked listening more than talking, especially on slow days like this. As much as he valued the peaceful moments, he knew from experience that calm could quickly give way to chaos. The calm shattered that evening when the fire alarm blared. The team scrambled to their feet, adrenaline kicking in as they moved with practiced efficiency. Ethan pulled on his gear, his focus sharpening as the details of the call came through. "House fire on Cedar Lane," their captain announced. "Caller says the family's out of town but thinks the dog is still inside. We're on rescue and containment." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He'd always had a soft spot for animals, often spending his free time helping at the local shelter. The thought of a dog trapped in a burning house set his resolve. He and his team rushed to the truck, and the familiar sound of the engine roaring to life filled the garage. The drive to Cedar Lane felt both fast and endless. As they approached, the orange glow of flames illuminated the night sky, and thick black smoke rose like a signal of distress. The scene was chaotic. Neighbors stood huddled on the sidewalks, their faces pale with worry, while the fire crackled and popped, consuming the small house. Ethan jumped down from the truck as it came to a stop. He quickly assessed the situation. Flames had engulfed the back of the house and smoke poured from the windows. The structure was still intact, but it was clear they didn't have much time. A man in his late 60s rushed forward, waving his arms frantically. "Thank God you're here," he gasped. "The family's gone. They left for the weekend, but their dog Max is inside. He's a golden retriever. I heard him barking earlier. Please, you have to get him." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "We'll do everything we can," he said firmly. The team moved into action. Jenna and Mike manned the hoses, dousing the flames at the entrance to create a safe path inside. Ethan and his partner Luis checked their oxygen tanks and prepared to enter the building. "Stay close," Ethan said as they stepped into the smoky interior. Inside, the heat was intense, and the smoke stung Ethan's eyes despite his mask. The layout of the house was simple: living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, but the fire had spread quickly, making navigation tricky. Furniture was overturned, and soot coated the walls, turning everything into a shadowy maze. "Max," Ethan called out, his voice muffled by the roar of the flames. He strained to listen, hoping for a bark or whimper in response. For now, there was only silence. The 2 firefighters moved methodically, checking each room as they went. The living room was empty except for a smoldering couch and a toppled bookshelf. In the hallway, the ceiling had started to sag, and bits of plaster fell with every step they took. "Kitchen next," Luis said, his voice tight. Ethan nodded. They moved toward the back of the house, where the fire was most intense. The kitchen doorframe was charred black, and flames licked at the cabinets inside. The smoke was thicker here, making it harder to see or breathe. I thought I heard something, Ethan said, pausing for a moment. He tilted his head, listening carefully. And then it came a faint, desperate sound. A bark, almost drowned out by the chaos. There Ethan pointed toward the far corner of the kitchen, where the noise had come from. But before they could move, a loud creak echoed above them, followed by the crash of a ceiling beam collapsing. Ethan and Luis jumped back as debris rained down, blocking their path. Ethan. We need to get out soon, Luis warned, his tone urgent. Ethan's jaw clenched. He knew the risk of staying too long. But the thought of leaving without Max was unbearable. We're not leaving without him, Ethan said. Let's find another way. Together they moved toward the side of the house, hoping to circle back and reach the kitchen through a different route. The clock was ticking, and the fire showed no signs of slowing down. Outside, the neighbors watched with bated breath, their faces reflecting the glow of the flames. The man who had called in the fire paced nervously, clutching a blanket around his shoulders. He kept glancing toward the house, whispering under his breath, "Please save him." Ethan and Luis pressed forward, determined not to let him down. Ethan's breath came heavy inside his mask as he and Luis pushed through the thick smoke. The roaring fire seemed to grow louder, almost as if it was challenging them to try and save the dog. With every step deeper into the house, the heat became more intense, beads of sweat forming under Ethan's helmet despite the protective gear. The bark came again, faint but unmistakable, urging them on. They reached the side hallway and found a small laundry room that led into the kitchen. It was partially blocked by a fallen cabinet, but Ethan and Luis worked quickly to clear the path. There's no telling how long this section's going to hold, Luis said, glancing up at the ceiling, where blackened beams sagged precariously. It'll hold long enough, Ethan replied, his voice steady. As soon as they stepped into the kitchen, they spotted Max. The golden retriever was huddled under a table in the corner, his body trembling. His fur was singed in places, and his eyes were wide with fear, but he let out another bark when he saw the firefighters. Ethan felt a surge of relief. "There you are, buddy," he said softly, moving closer. The flames had crept dangerously close to the table, and smoke hung thick in the air. Ethan crouched low, reaching out a hand toward Max. "It's okay, I'm here to help you." The dog hesitated for a moment, his instincts torn between fear and the hope of rescue. Finally, he inched forward, his tail tucked between his legs. Ethan wasted no time, wrapping Max in his fire-resistant jacket to shield him from the heat. "Got him," Ethan called to Luis. "Then let's move," Luis replied, motioning toward the door they had cleared. Ethan held Max securely as they navigated back through the house. Every step was a calculated risk. The fire had spread further, consuming the walls and leaving parts of the floor unstable. The weight of Max in Ethan's arms was nothing compared to the urgency of getting him out safely. Just as they reached the living room, a loud crack echoed through the house. One of the ceiling beams in the hallway collapsed, sending a shower of embers and debris in their direction. "Go," Luis shouted, pulling Ethan back and shielding them with his body as the beam came down. Ethan felt the heat of the flames inches away but kept moving. With Luis covering their path, they made it to the front door, where the cool night air hit them like a wave of relief. As they stepped outside, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Ethan could barely hear them over the pounding of his heart. He carried Max straight to the waiting paramedics, who were ready with oxygen masks and blankets. The man who had called in the fire ran forward, his face a mixture of tears and gratitude. "Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." Ethan handed Max over to the paramedics, who began checking the dog for injuries. "He's shaken but alive," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion setting in. Max, now out of immediate danger, looked up at Ethan with eyes full of unspoken gratitude. His tail gave a weak wag as if to say thank you. The man knelt beside the dog, stroking his fur gently. "You saved him," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You didn't have to, but you did." Thank you so much. Ethan gave a small nod, brushing soot from his gloves. He's part of the family. That's what we're here for. The crew worked quickly to douse the remaining flames, and by the time the fire was under control, the house was a charred shell of what it had been. Still, there was a sense of victory. Max had made it out alive, and no one had been hurt in the process. Back at the firehouse later that night, Ethan sat on the bench in the locker room, peeling off his gear. The exhaustion hit him all at once, the adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue now fading. He thought about Max, about how close they had come to losing him, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "Nice work out there," Louise said, clapping him on the shoulder as he walked by. "Thanks," Ethan replied, managing a tired smile. As Ethan drove home that night, he couldn't stop thinking about Max. He wondered about the family who owned him, whether they knew what had happened, whether they would even be able to rebuild their lives after the fire. He hoped they would find comfort in knowing their beloved dog had been saved. The next morning, Ethan woke to find a small article in the Pinewood Gazette about the fire. The headline read, "Brave firefighters save family dog in Cedar Lane blaze." Ethan skimmed the article, which briefly mentioned Max and the efforts of the crew, but he quickly folded the paper and set it aside. For him, it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what was right. What Ethan didn't know was that this act of kindness had set something in motion. Max's rescue would soon lead to something much greater than he could have imagined. The days following the fire passed in a blur for Ethan. There were always calls to answer, equipment to maintain, and the constant hum of life at the firehouse. Pinewood Creek had its rhythms, and Ethan was used to moving with them. But something about that night on Cedar Lane stayed with him. He thought about Max often. He'd seen firsthand how the dog had clung to life, despite being surrounded by flames and fear. Ethan knew that same will to survive often mirrored the strength in people. Maybe that's why it mattered so much to him. Rescuing Max wasn't just about saving a life, it was about preserving a bond, a connection that gave families hope even in their hardest moments. A week after the fire, Ethan stopped by the local animal shelter to check on Max. He had heard through the grapevine that the dog had been brought there temporarily while the owner's situation was sorted out. The shelter was run by a cheerful woman named Clara, who had known Ethan since high school. "Ethan Parker," Clara said with a wide grin as he walked through the door. "I heard you were Max's hero. He's been the talk of the shelter since he came in." Ethan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just doing my job, Clara. Is he still here?" Clara nodded, motioning for him to follow her. "Come on, I'll show you. He's in great shape, all things considered. A little skittish at first, but he's been warming up to everyone. I think he knows he's safe now." When Ethan reached Max's kennel, he crouched down and whistled softly. The golden retriever perked up immediately, his tail wagging as he padded over to the gate. Ethan smiled, reaching through the bars to scratch behind Max's ears. "Hey buddy," he said. "How are you holding up?" Max responded with a lick to Ethan's hand, his eyes bright and full of recognition. It was as if he hadn't forgotten the man who had carried him out of the fire. Ethan spent a few minutes with him, talking softly and letting Max nuzzle against his hand. "He's a good dog," Ethan said to Clara. "He really is," she agreed. "His family's been in touch, by the way. They're out of town dealing with some things, but they're relieved he's okay. They'll be back soon to pick him up." Ethan nodded, feeling a wave of relief. He didn't know the family personally, but it comforted him to know that Max would be reunited with the people who loved him. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's life returned to its usual routine. There were more calls to respond to minor incidents like a tree falling on a shed and a kitchen stove catching fire. But through it all, the memory of Max lingered. Sometimes, when Ethan walked through the quiet streets of Pinewood Creek, he found himself wondering how the golden retriever was doing. It wasn't until 3 weeks after the fire that Ethan got his answer. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and Ethan was at home repairing an old bookshelf he'd picked up at a yard sale. The sound of a car pulling into his driveway caught his attention, and he looked up to see a middle-aged couple stepping out of a weathered SUV. The man was tall and wiry, wearing a baseball cap that shaded his kind face. The woman had a gentle smile and carried a large basket in her hands. Beside them, tail wagging furiously, was Max. Ethan's heart lifted at the sight. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, as the couple approached. "Mr. Parker," the man asked, extending a hand. "I'm David Morgan, and this is my wife Lynn. We're Max's owners." "It's great to meet you," Ethan said, shaking David's hand. He crouched down to greet Max, who immediately ran up to him, barking happily and licking his face. "Hey Max, good to see you too, buddy." Lynn's eyes shimmered with emotion as she watched the reunion. "We just wanted to come by and thank you in person," she said. "We can't begin to tell you what it means to us that you saved him." David nodded. "When we got the call about the fire, we thought we'd lost everything. Knowing Max made it out because of you, that's something we'll never forget." Ethan straightened up, his hands resting on his hips. "I'm just glad I could help," he said honestly. "He's a tough dog. I think he saved himself as much as we saved him." Lynn handed the basket to Ethan, her smile warm and sincere. "This is for you. It's just a small way of saying thank you. We know it's not enough, but we wanted you to know how much we appreciate what you did." Ethan took the basket, surprised by its weight. Inside, he could see jars of homemade preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, and a hand-knit scarf folded neatly on top. There was also an envelope tucked in among the items. David cleared his throat. "It's not much, but we wanted to give you something to say thank you. We know you probably don't expect it, but, well, you went above and beyond for Max." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "You didn't have to do this," he said, touched by the gesture. "We wanted to," David said firmly. "What you did for Max for our family means more than words can say." Ethan hesitated but eventually accepted, recognizing the sincerity behind their gesture. He smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He looked down at Max, who was leaning against his leg, and gave the dog a scratch behind the ears. "You've got a good family, Max," he said softly. David and Lynn stayed for a while, chatting with Ethan about the fire, their lives, and their plans to rebuild. By the time they left, Ethan felt like he'd gained more than gratitude. He'd made a connection that would last far beyond that one night on Cedar Lane. As he stood on his porch watching them drive away, Max's head sticking out of the window, Ethan couldn't help but feel that life had a way of surprising you. Sometimes, the smallest acts of courage could ripple out in ways you never expected, bringing people together and reminding you of the goodness in the world. Ethan watched the Morgans' SUV disappear down the road, the sound of their tires crunching on the gravel driveway lingering in the cool morning air. He carried the basket inside and set it on the kitchen counter, glancing at the note nestled between the jars of preserves. Unfolding it carefully, he read the handwritten message. "Dear Mr. Parker, you gave us something priceless when you saved Max. He is more than a pet to us, he's part of our family. Words can't express how grateful we are, but we hope this small token shows how much your kindness has touched our hearts. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. With gratitude. David and Lynn Morgan." Ethan set the note down, feeling a swell of emotion. It wasn't often that people went out of their way to show this level of appreciation. For him, it had always been about the act of helping, not the recognition, but this simple gesture reminded him of why he loved his work. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by the firehouse to drop off some extra preserves from the basket. The crew was gathered in the kitchen, laughing over a story Mike was telling about a particularly eventful bachelor party he'd attended. "Hey Parker," Mike called out as Ethan walked in. "You're just in time to hear about how I ended up in a canoe in my tuxedo." "I think I'll pass," Ethan replied with a grin, setting the jars on the counter. Jenna noticed the scarf tucked under his arm. "That looks nice. What's the occasion?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then explained about the visit from the Morgans and their heartfelt gift. As he spoke, the room grew quiet, his colleagues listening intently. "Man, that's something," Luis said, shaking his head. "It's not every day people go out of their way like that." "I didn't expect it, but they insisted," Ethan said. "You earned it," Jenna said firmly. "It's not like you're out there asking for rewards. People just appreciate what you do." Ethan shrugged, but he couldn't hide his smile. Moments like this reminded him of the deeper impact his work had, beyond the immediate emergencies and firefighting. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself thinking more about the Morgans and their plans to rebuild. He couldn't imagine how overwhelming it must have been for them to lose their home so suddenly. Though they hadn't asked for anything, Ethan felt a tug in his chest, a desire to do something more for them. One Saturday, he stopped by the hardware store and picked up a few supplies: a gift card for building materials, a toolbox, and a sturdy leash for Max. He wrapped the items in plain brown paper and wrote a short note. For Max and the family who loves him. From someone who's grateful to see him wag his tail again. The next day, Ethan drove out to the temporary rental the Morgans were staying in. It was a small house at the edge of town, with a modest porch and a patch of grass out front where Max was lounging in the sun. The dog leaped to his feet as Ethan approached, barking happily and running to greet him. David came to the door, smiling broadly when he saw Ethan. "Parker. This is a nice surprise. Come on in." Ethan stepped inside, greeted by the comforting smell of coffee brewing and the sight of Lynn arranging flowers on the kitchen table. "I just wanted to drop off a little something," he said, setting the package on the counter. David opened it carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to gratitude as he saw what was inside. "Ethan, you didn't have to do this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to," Ethan replied simply. "You've got a long road ahead with rebuilding, and I figured a little help wouldn't hurt." Lynn came over to inspect the contents, her eyes shining. "This is so thoughtful," she said. "You've already done so much for us, and now this. We're just blown away." Ethan waved off their thanks, feeling slightly awkward under the weight of their gratitude. "It's nothing, really. I'm just glad to see Max looking happy and healthy." They spent some time chatting, and before Ethan left, Lynn insisted he take a loaf of banana bread she had just baked. As he drove away, he felt lighter somehow, as if the simple act of giving had lifted a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Back at home, Ethan sat on his porch, sipping coffee and reflecting on the past few weeks. Life in Pinewood Creek had settled back into its usual rhythm, but this experience had left a lasting impression. He thought about the connections forged in moments of crisis, the way small gestures could ripple out to create something bigger. Max's rescue had been just one act in a long career of service, but it had reminded Ethan of the profound impact kindness could have on others and on himself. What Ethan didn't yet realize was that the ripples of this act were still spreading. There was more kindness to come, not just for the Morgans but for Ethan himself. Months passed and Pinewood Creek shifted through the seasons. The crisp chill of spring gave way to the warmth of summer, and with it came the sounds of life returning to normal. For Ethan, the work never stopped. There were always fires to extinguish, trees to clear after storms, and people to help. Yet, every so often, he would catch himself thinking of the night he saved Max, the golden retriever whose courage had inspired so much gratitude and connection. He didn't see the Morgans much during the summer. They were busy rebuilding their home on Cedar Lane, a process that involved countless hours of planning, organizing, and navigating insurance claims. Ethan thought about stopping by a few times but decided to give them space. He figured they had enough on their plates without him getting in the way. By early fall, word spread through town that the Morgans' house was finally finished. The rebuilt home stood proudly on its lot, a testament to their resilience and determination. Ethan happened to drive past one day while on his way to the station and smiled when he saw Max lounging on the freshly sodded lawn, his golden fur shining in the sunlight. Life moved on, and Ethan assumed that chapter was behind him. He didn't expect anything more to come of it. After all, he had simply been doing his job. But one crisp October afternoon, as he was cleaning out the firehouse truck bays, a familiar SUV pulled into the lot. Ethan looked up, surprised to see David and Lynn Morgan stepping out, Max trotting happily alongside them. They waved, and Ethan set down the hose he was coiling, walking over to greet them. "Hey there," Ethan said, giving Max a pat on the head. "It's good to see you all." "It's good to see you too," Lynn said, her smile warm. "We've been meaning to stop by for a while, but with the house rebuild and everything, things have been a little hectic." "How's it coming along?" Ethan asked. David beamed. "It's done. Feels like home again. And Max has been loving the new yard." Ethan nodded, genuinely happy for them. "That's great to hear. You've all been through a lot." "We have," Lynn said, her voice soft. "But we've also been thinking about how much we have to be grateful for. That night could have ended so differently if it weren't for you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the center of attention. "You don't need to thank me again. I'm just glad Max is okay." "We know you don't expect anything, but we wanted to do something more," David said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. He handed it to Ethan, who hesitated before taking it. "What's this?" Ethan asked, frowning slightly. "It's a gift," Lynn said. "There's $1,000 in there. We've been saving up since the fire, and now that things are settling down, we wanted to give you something to show how much your kindness means to us. You didn't just save Max, you gave us hope during one of the hardest times of our lives." Ethan opened the envelope, his eyes widening as he saw the stack of crisp bills inside. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. "This is too much," he said, shaking his head. "I can't accept this." David placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You can, and you will," he said firmly. "You went above and beyond for our family, and this is the least we can do." Ethan looked at the couple, their faces filled with gratitude, and then down at Max, who wagged his tail as if to second their sentiment. Slowly, Ethan nodded, tucking the envelope into his pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means a lot." The Morgans stayed for a while, catching up with Ethan and sharing stories about their new home. They laughed about Max's antics, how he had already claimed the comfiest spot on the new couch and refused to budge when it was time for bed. Before they left, Lynn hugged Ethan tightly, and David shook his hand with a grip that spoke volumes. As the SUV pulled away, Ethan stood in the driveway, watching until it disappeared down the street. He thought about the unexpected twists life could take, how a single night could create bonds that lasted far longer than the flames he had extinguished. The $1,000 would go a long way. Of course, it would help cover some of the repairs Ethan had been meaning to make on his old truck, and maybe even leave room for a few extras. But what stayed with him more than the money was the overwhelming sense of connection. Later that evening, Ethan sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. A light breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. He thought about Max, about the Morgans, and about how small acts of courage and kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways you never expected. Ethan didn't consider himself a hero. To him, saving Max had been as natural as breathing. But as he gazed out at the quiet street, he realized that sometimes, what seemed like a small gesture to one person could mean the world to someone else. And that, Ethan decided, was a reward greater than any envelope could ever hold.